The man who swears to protect you holds a double-edged sword. One edge faces your enemies, the other rests gently against your own throat. Why is it that the hand sworn to guard is so often the first to strike? How does the loyalty of a decade curdle into betrayal in a single night? This is the story of power's most intimate and brutal truth. It is the whisper in the gilded hall, the shadow behind the throne, the sudden chill in the emperor's heart. It is the chronicle of the palace coup, a poison that once brewed never loses its potency. In the first century of the Common Era, the Roman world was a stage for this bloody theatre. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite protectors, had discovered a terrible secret. They were the true masters of Rome. They could create an emperor with a cheer and unmake him with a blade. The lesson was learned in blood and repeated with cynical efficiency. An emperor's life was a commodity, its value determined not by the Senate or the people, but by the greed in the barracks. The year 193. The Emperor Pertinax is dead, murdered in his own palace by the very men who were paid to be his living shield. They had demanded a bonus he could not pay, and so they paid him in steel. The throne of the most powerful empire on earth was now vacant. What followed was not a dignified succession, not a debate in the Senate, but the single most shameful moment in Roman history. The Praetorians did not choose a new emperor. They sold one. The gates of the Praetorian camp became an auction block. Two wealthy senators, Flavius Sulpicianus and Didius Julianus, arrived to bid for the world. Sulpicianus, the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax, was already inside, trying to negotiate. Julianus, hearing of the opportunity, rushed from a dinner party, propped up by ladders at the camp wall, his voice slurred with wine and ambition. The soldiers, like cynical merchants, played one against the other. Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sesterces per man, a respectable sum, but Julianus, from outside the walls, shouted his bid, 25,000. The empire was his. The guardsmen swung open the gates, hailed him as Caesar, and escorted their newly purchased emperor to the palace. Didius Julianus sat on a throne still warm from his predecessor's body, surrounded by the men who had just committed murder for profit. He was the master of the world and a prisoner in his own home. He had bought the purple robe, but he could not buy respect, he could not buy safety, and he could not buy time. Every shadow must have looked like an assassin. Every footstep must have sounded like his doom. An empire is built on the bones of enemies, but it always collapses from the betrayal of friends. The reign of Didius Julianus lasted a mere 66 days. The legions on the frontiers, disgusted by the auction in the capital, declared their own generals as emperors. As the armies of Septimius Severus marched on Rome, the Praetorians who had created Julianus saw a new, more profitable opportunity. They seized their emperor, the man for whom they had sold their honor, and sought to trade his life for their own. The Senate, smelling the changing winds, declared Julianus a public enemy. A single soldier was sent to the palace to carry out the sentence. He found the emperor of the world alone, cowering, weeping. His last words were a pathetic question. But what evil have I done? He had done nothing, and that was the problem. He was not a ruler, he was a purchase. He was a receipt for a transaction written in blood. The soldier dispatched him with a single sword stroke, and the sordid affair was over. This was the brutal mechanic laid bare. The Praetorian Guard was a political engine fueled by gold and fear. They were the kingmakers and the executioners, a shadow government whose decrees were written with the points of their gladii. They would go on to murder and elevate emperors for centuries, turning the palace from a center of power into a gilded abattoir. Caligula, Galba, Elagabalus. The list of emperors who felt the Praetorian blade is long. Each thought they could control the beast. Each learned that when you hire wolves to guard the sheep, you cannot be surprised when they develop a taste for the shepherd. What makes a person betray the one they swore to protect? Is it greed, fear, or the intoxicating realization that the man they guard is just a man made of flesh and blood, as vulnerable as any other? The Roman model of betrayal, forged in the cynical heart of the capital, was crude but effective. It was a lesson in power that would not be forgotten. The seeds of this brutal pragmatism sown by the Praetorians would travel eastward, finding fertile ground in a new capital on the shores of the Bosphorus, where the art of the coup would be refined from a soldier's brawl into a masterpiece of deadly intrigue. We've seen how a bodyguard's greed can put a price on an empire. But what if you were one of those Praetorians faced with a choice? Would you stand by your oath to a flawed ruler, or would you take the gold and roll the dice on a new one? Let us know in the comments below. Is it loyalty or is it wealth? Your vote is your voice in this bloody history. The new Rome, Constantinople, rose on the Bosphorus as a fortress of Christianity and civilization, a beacon in a darkening world. But within the sacred walls of its great palace, the old Roman sickness festered, mutating into something more complex, more insidious. The straightforward brutality of the Praetorian sword was replaced by the Byzantine labyrinth of intrigue. Here, a coup was not simply a mutiny, it was a work of art, painted with poison, woven with whispers, and often executed by the hands of a lover, a son, or a trusted friend. Power was a family disease, and the cure was almost always fatal. The dagger was still a tool, but it was now accompanied by the silken cord, the poisoned chalice, the blinding iron, and the monastery gate, which slammed shut on a deposed emperor, condemning him to a living death. In Byzantium, you did not just kill a rival, you erased him from the world of men, turning a Caesar into a sightless monk, his ambitions reduced to memorizing psalms in a cold cell. The story of Basil I is a masterclass in this refined cruelty. He was a man of immense strength and charisma, a peasant who rose from the stables to become the co-emperor and adopted son of Michael III, a ruler known to history, perhaps unfairly, as the drunkard. Michael showered Basil with honors, titles, and power. He made him the second most powerful man in the empire. He loved him like a brother. It was a fatal miscalculation. Basil, having tasted power, now craved all of it. He had already conspired to murder Michael's powerful uncle Bardas with the emperor's blessing. Having eliminated one rival, Basil saw only one obstacle remaining: his own benefactor. The betrayal was planned with chilling intimacy. On the night of September 24th, 867, after a banquet, Michael retired to his chambers, heavy with wine. Basil and a small group of co-conspirators were given access to the palace by trusted insiders. They moved through the silent corridors, their footsteps muffled by the rich carpets. The imperial bodyguard, who should have died to the last man protecting their emperor, had been bribed or intimidated into inaction. They found the locks on the emperor's bedchamber broken. Inside, Michael lay asleep. There was no struggle. There was no grand confrontation. There was only butchery. One of the assassins, Basil's own kinsman, severed the emperor's hands with a sword blow. Another conspirator then thrust a blade into his heart. Basil, the stable boy, the emperor's friend, the adopted son, watched as the man who had raised him from nothing was slaughtered like an animal. He walked out of the chamber, not as a murderer, but as Basil I, sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire, founder of the glorious Macedonian dynasty. This was the Byzantine way. The palace was not a home, it was a chessboard where the pieces were human lives. Empresses conspired against their own sons, generals marched on the capital, their campaigns financed by promises of wealth to the city's factions. And eunuchs, the third sex of the court, who could father no dynasties of their own, became the most masterful players of the great game. They were the emperor's eyes and ears, his most trusted administrators, and, when the time was right, his most efficient killers. Their loyalty was always for sale, their motives hidden behind a mask of servility. In Byzantium, poison was just politics in a liquid form. The history of its throne is a litany of violent depositions. Emperor Justinian II had his nose slit and was exiled, only to return years later, a terrifying figure with a golden prosthetic nose, to wreak a horrible revenge on his enemies. Empress Irene, celebrated for restoring icons to the churches, seized power by having her own son, the Emperor Constantine VI, arrested and blinded in the very same purple room where he had been born. The act was so brutal it shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the age. Could you imagine a mother inflicting such a fate upon her child, all for the sake of a throne? The great palace of Constantinople, with its mechanical golden trees and roaring lions, was designed to awe foreign ambassadors, but for those who lived within its walls, it was a golden cage filled with venomous snakes. Every curtain could hide a spy, every cup of wine could be a death sentence, every friendly smile could conceal a dagger. The cycle was relentless. A usurper would seize the throne through blood, rule with paranoia, and then, almost inevitably, be overthrown by the same methods he had employed. Basil I, the murderer of his friend Michael, reigned for 19 years and died in a suspicious hunting accident. His dynasty, founded on an act of supreme betrayal, would itself be plagued by internal strife and assassination. The Byzantine emperors learned a lesson that the Romans had only partially understood. The most dangerous enemy is not the barbarian at the gate, but the courtier who bows the lowest. This intricate dance of death, this web of conspiracy, was not unique to the Christian world. Far to the east, in the glittering capital of another great empire, a different set of guardsmen, slaves brought from the steppes, were learning the same bloody lesson, that the man who holds the sword is the true master of the man who wears the crown. The drama would soon unfold in Baghdad. The city of Baghdad in the 9th century was the heart of the world. It was the center of the Abbasid Caliphate, an empire of fabulous wealth and breathtaking intellectual achievement. Here, scholars translated the works of Aristotle while European kings could barely write their own names. The House of Wisdom was a beacon of learning, and the city's markets overflowed with silks from China and spices from India. It was a golden age, but this golden age was built on a foundation of sand, and the caliphs themselves had supplied the water that would wash it all away. To secure their power against rival Arab and Persian factions, the caliphs, starting with al-Mutasim, began to create a new military force. They imported thousands of Turkic youths from the Central Asian steppes. These were the ghulams, slave soldiers raised from boyhood to know nothing but loyalty to the caliph. They were superb horsemen and archers, fierce and disciplined. They were the caliph's personal guard, his protectors, his fist. And, inevitably, they would become his executioners. The caliphs had made the same mistake as the Roman emperors before them. They had created a Praetorian Guard, a military caste with no ties to the local population, whose only allegiance was to itself. Initially, the ghulams were a symbol of the caliph's power, but soon they became the source of it. They grew in number and influence, demanding higher pay and greater privileges. Their presence in Baghdad caused friction with the local population, leading to riots. To appease both the citizens and his guards, Caliph al-Mutasim moved the capital 70 miles north to a new purpose-built city, Samarra. It was a city of magnificent palaces and mosques, a sprawling military administrative complex. But in isolating his court and his guards, the caliph had also trapped himself. In Samarra, the caliphs were no longer rulers of a vast empire. They were prisoners of their own army. A caliph who buys his swordsmen will one day find his throne has been sold by them. The breaking point came in the year 861 with the reign of Caliph al-Mutawakkil. He was a pious and strong-willed ruler, but he made powerful enemies, including within his own family. He had designated his eldest son al-Muntasir as his heir, but then humiliated him and threatened to pass the succession to a younger son. Al-Muntasir, fearing for his life and his future, found willing allies in the leaders of the Turkic Guard, whom al-Mutawakkil had also alienated. The conspiracy was swift and brutal. On a December night, while the caliph was drinking with a close friend, the Turkic guardsmen burst into the chamber. The few loyal attendants were cut down, The caliph's friend threw himself over his master, trying to shield him, a futile act of loyalty in a room filled with betrayal. The guards' swords rose and fell. Al-Mutawakkil, the commander of the faithful, the shadow of God on earth, was hacked to death at the feet of his own son. Al-Muntasir was immediately hailed as the new caliph. He had the throne, but he was a puppet. The Turkic generals who had put him there were the ones pulling the strings. His reign lasted only 6 months before he died, possibly from poison, administered by the very men who had helped him commit patricide. His death unleashed a decade of chaos known as the Anarchy at Samarra. It was a horrifying spectacle. The Turkic generals became the undisputed masters. They would choose a caliph, extort money and power from him, and when he resisted, or when their greed demanded a new victim, they would murder him and install another. One caliph was dragged from the palace, beaten, and left to die of thirst in the scorching sun. Another was blinded and thrown into a dungeon. The rulers of the Islamic world were treated like toys, to be broken and discarded at the whim of their slave soldiers. The anarchy at Samarra shattered the central authority of the Abbasid Caliphate. Provinces broke away, governors declared themselves independent rulers, and the vast empire began to crumble from within. The Ghulams, in their short-sighted pursuit of power and wealth, had destroyed the very institution that gave them purpose and legitimacy. They had killed the host, and now the parasite was dying too. The splendor of Baghdad and Samarra could not hide the rot at the core. The story was depressingly familiar. A ruler creates an elite force to protect himself from his own people, only to discover that he has forged the very instrument of his own destruction. It is a timeless trap, a paradox of power. This cycle of betrayal was not limited to the guardsman's barracks or the slave soldier's mutiny. The poison could be much more intimate, flowing not from the loyalty of a stranger, but from the love of a brother. To see this deadly dynamic at work, we must travel north to the cold, damp castles of England, where a family feud for a crown would escalate into a saga of betrayal so profound it would become a legend of dark ambition, a war where the enemy shared your own blood. In the mist-shrouded Isle of England during the 15th century, the struggle for the throne was not just a political contest, it was a family vendetta of Shakespearean proportions. The War of the Roses was a 30-year bloodbath between two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white. It was a war fought not just on muddy battlefields, but in the shadowy corridors of power, where alliances shifted like sand, and a cousin's smile could hide a sharpened dagger. This was a dynastic conflict that devolved into a series of brutal palace coups, where kings were made and unmade with shocking speed. A crown won with a kinsman's blood is the heaviest burden a king can wear. Here, the ultimate usurper was not a guardsman or a general, but a brother. Richard of Gloucester, a figure so consumed by ambition that his name would become synonymous with tyranny for centuries to come. He was the brother of King Edward IV, a formidable Yorkist warrior who had seized the throne from the Lancastrians. Richard was his brother's most loyal supporter, a brilliant military commander, and a shrewd administrator. He was trusted, he was family. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, the kingdom was thrown into turmoil. His heir was his 12-year-old son, Edward V. Richard of Gloucester was named Lord Protector, entrusted with safeguarding the boy king and the realm until he came of age. It was the moment Richard had been waiting for. He moved with cold, calculated precision. His first act was to intercept the young king who was travelling to London. He arrested the boy's maternal relatives, the Woodville family, accusing them of plotting against him. He then escorted his nephew to London, not for a coronation, but for an incarceration. The young Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their own protection. The Tower, a royal palace and fortress, now became a royal prison. With the princes secured, Richard of Gloucester began his masterstroke. He orchestrated a public campaign to delegitimize his own brother's children. a priest was found to declare that the late King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, therefore their children were illegitimate and had no claim to the throne. The path was now clear. On June 26, 1483, Richard of Gloucester accepted the crown, becoming King Richard III. But what of the two boys in the tower? The young king and his brother, the princes in the tower, were seen playing in the fortress gardens for a time, and then they simply vanished. They were never seen again. Their fate remains one of history's most enduring and chilling mysteries. Did Richard III, their uncle and protector, have them murdered to secure his throne? The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. To allow them to live would be to leave a focal point for rebellion, a constant threat to his reign. The story, as pieced together by later chroniclers, is a Gothic horror. It tells of an assassin, Sir James Tyrrell, sent to the tower under the king's orders. He allegedly found the boys sleeping in their bed and had them smothered with their pillows, their small bodies buried secretly within the fortress walls. Whether this account is the literal truth or Tudor propaganda written by his enemies, the result was the same. The princes were gone, and Richard sat uneasily on a throne stained by the suspicion of a monstrous crime. Could you murder your own family for the ultimate prize, knowing that the ghosts of your victims would haunt your every waking moment? Richard's reign was short and turbulent. He was a capable ruler in many ways, but he could never escape the shadow of his usurpation and the rumours of murder. His seizure of power had fractured the Yorkist cause, driving many of his former allies into the camp of his rival, the Lancastrian heir, Henry Tudor, who was living in exile. 2 years after Richard claimed the crown, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III's reign came to a bloody end. In the heat of the battle, seeing his army begin to crumble due to betrayals from his own nobles, Richard gambled everything on a desperate cavalry charge aimed directly at Henry Tudor. It was a final, frantic act. He was unhorsed and surrounded, fighting on foot until he was cut down, the last English king to die in battle. The crown that had rolled from his head was picked up from a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's. The Tudor dynasty had begun, built upon the ruin of Richard's ambition. His story became a cautionary tale of how the thirst for power can turn a brother into a monster. But what if such an act, the murder of one's own kin for the sake of the throne, was not a crime but a state policy? In a vast empire to the east, this very principle was not a dark secret but the law of the land. If you had to pass judgment on Richard III based on the evidence, what would he be? A monstrous tyrant who murdered children to steal a crown, or a tragic hero, a capable ruler, slandered by the Tudor propagandists who defeated him? Share your verdict in the comments. History is waiting for your decision. In the sprawling, opulent Topkapi Palace of Istanbul, the heart of the mighty Ottoman Empire, the rules of succession were brutally simple. Here, fratricide, the murder of one's own brothers, was not a crime born of ambition like Richard III's. It was a legally sanctioned principle, an instrument of state policy designed to prevent the very civil wars and coups that had torn England apart. The law of Fatih, established by Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, gave a new sultan the right, even the obligation, to execute his brothers and male relatives upon his accession. The logic was cold and ruthless. It was better for a few princes to die than for the empire to be ripped apart by prolonged wars of succession. The death of one man was a tragedy. The death of a prince was a political necessity. This law turned the sultan's harem, the private heart of the palace, into the most dangerous place on earth for a young man with royal blood. The ascension of a new sultan was a moment not of celebration, but of terror. As the old sultan lay dying, a silent, frantic race against time began. Each of the princes, who were often serving as provincial governors, would rush towards the capital. The first one to reach Istanbul and secure the loyalty of the court and the army would be the new sultan. His first official act would be to dispatch the imperial executioners. These executioners were often deaf mutes, ensuring they could not be suborned by pleas or bribes, nor could they reveal any palace secrets. They travelled with a silk bowstring. According to Ottoman tradition, the blood of the Sultan's dynasty was sacred and could not be shed. Therefore, princes were not killed by the sword, but by strangulation. Imagine the scene, repeated through the centuries. A young prince, perhaps a boy, is in his chambers. He has just received news of his father's death and his brother's accession. He knows what is coming. The doors open, and silent, powerful men enter. There is no anger, no argument. It is a ritual. The silk cord is looped around his neck. In the seraglio, the silence of a silk cord was louder than any declaration of war. This brutal system, while effective in preventing civil wars, created a new kind of palace intrigue, one centered not just on the princes, but on their mothers. The harem was a political battleground. Each of the sultan's concubines who bore a son fought fiercely to ensure her child would be the one to survive and inherit the throne. They forged alliances with viziers, generals, and eunuchs, weaving intricate webs of conspiracy. The Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, often wielded immense power, becoming a de facto ruler from behind the harem's walls. But even this system could not prevent all coups. The Ottomans had their own Praetorians, the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps originally composed of Christian boys taken from the Balkans and converted to Islam. The Janissaries were the Sultan's household troops and the backbone of his army. Like the Praetorians and the Ghulams before them, their proximity to power eventually corrupted them. When they became dissatisfied with the Sultan's policies, or when their pay was in arrears, they would mutiny. Their signal for revolt was to overturn their giant soup cauldrons in the barracks square. This seemingly simple act was a declaration of war on the throne. The Janissaries overthrew and murdered several sultans. In 1622, they deposed the young Sultan Osman II, a reformer who had tried to curb their power. They subjected him to public humiliation, parading him through the streets of Istanbul on a common nag before he was taken to the infamous Yedikule fortress and strangled in his cell. Later, the horrors of the law of Fatih led to a change in practice. Instead of executing all rival princes, they were confined for life to a special part of the Topkapi Palace, known as the cafes, or the cage. Here, they lived in gilded imprisonment, surrounded by luxury, but cut off from the world under constant surveillance. This practice saved their lives, but it often destroyed their minds. When a sultan died without an heir, a prince might be dragged from the cage after decades of isolation, blinking in the sunlight, utterly insane or incompetent, and placed upon the throne of a vast empire. The solution to one problem had created another, breeding a succession of weak and unstable rulers. The Janissaries, the Ottoman kingmakers of the Bosphorus, were a formidable force. But far to the north, in a new and frozen capital rising from the swamps, another empire was forging its own elite guard, soldiers who would learn that the fate of an emperor, or more often, an empress, could be decided not by law or lineage, but by the cold steel of their bayonets. The death of Peter the Great in 1725 left the young Russian Empire at a crossroads. He was a titan, a force of nature who had dragged his nation into the modern world. But he had changed the laws of succession and died without clearly naming an heir. He had created a power vacuum, and as nature abhors a vacuum, the Russian Guard regiments rushed to fill it. For the next several decades, the history of the Russian throne was written not by imperial decree, but by the will of these elite soldiers. The Preobrazhensky, the Semyonovsky, the Izmailovsky regiments. These were the Praetorians of St. Petersburg, and they became the arbiters of who would wear the crown. An empress could be made overnight with a rousing speech in the barracks and a few barrels of vodka. In 18th century Russia, the surest path to the throne was paved with the cobblestones of a guardsman's barracks. The era of palace coups had begun. It was a uniquely Russian phenomenon. Unlike in Rome or Baghdad, the guard rarely acted for its own sake. Instead, powerful court factions and ambitious nobles used the Guard as their instrument, as a powerful, armed fist to place their preferred candidate on the throne. And remarkably, these candidates were almost always women. Peter's wife, his niece, his daughter, a succession of empresses owed their crowns to the swords of the Guardsmen. The first coup came immediately after Peter's death. One faction supported his grandson, while another, led by the powerful Prince Menshikov, supported Peter's widow, Catherine. As the highest officials of the state debated, Menshikov settled the argument decisively. He had the Guard regiment surround the palace, and the drums of the Preobrazhensky regiment rattled the windows of the chamber. The message was clear. The officials quickly saw the wisdom in Menshikov's choice, and the low-born Lithuanian peasant woman became Catherine I, Empress of all Russia. The pattern was set. In 1741, Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth, a beautiful and indolent princess, seized power in another classic guardsman's coup. On a freezing November night, she went to the barracks of the Preobrazhensky regiment, her father's old unit. Holding a silver cross, she appealed to the soldiers, "You know whose daughter I am. Follow me." Fired up by her charisma and promises of reward, the guardsmen proclaimed her empress, marched on the Winter Palace, and arrested the infant emperor Ivan VI and his family. The coup was swift, bloodless, and breathtakingly simple. Elizabeth would rule for 20 years, a reign of glittering balls and cultural flourishing, all of it resting on the foundation of that one night of military insurrection. But the most famous and consequential coup of the era was yet to come. It was the masterstroke that brought Catherine the Great to power in 1762. Her husband, Peter III, was the grandson of Peter the Great. He was a deeply unpopular emperor, erratic, pro-Prussian, and contemptuous of Russian customs and the Orthodox Church. He alienated the court, the clergy, and, most fatally, the Guard. His wife, Catherine, a clever and ambitious German princess, was the complete opposite. She was intelligent, cultivated Russian allies, and demonstratively pious. She was everything the Russian elite wanted in a ruler. While Peter played with his toy soldiers and offended his most powerful subjects, Catherine and her lover, Grigory Orlov, an officer in the Guard, were planning a conspiracy. The coup was launched in late June. With the emperor away at his country estate, the Orlov brothers and their fellow conspirators went into action. In the early morning hours, they roused the Guard regiments. Once again, fueled by patriotism and vodka, the soldiers eagerly swore allegiance to Catherine. By the time Peter III realized what was happening, it was too late. Catherine, dressed in the uniform of a guardsman, had been proclaimed empress in the capital, which was firmly in her control. Peter vacillated, missed his chance to fight back, and ultimately abdicated, hoping to be allowed to retire to his estates. It was a naive hope. He was taken into custody by Catherine's supporters and transferred to a country house at Ropsha. A few days later, the world was informed that the former emperor had died of a severe colic. No one believed it. The official story was a thin veil over a political assassination. A letter from Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, seemed to confess what had happened: a drunken brawl, a sudden death. "He is no more," the letter reportedly said. Whether Catherine ordered the murder or simply allowed it to happen has been debated for centuries. What is certain is that her husband's convenient death secured her throne. She would go on to rule for 34 years, expanding the empire and earning the title the Great. Her reign was an age of enlightenment and conquest, but it began with a classic palace coup, a conspiracy in a boudoir, an uprising in the barracks, and a suspicious death in a locked room. The Russian coups were about replacing one monarch with another, preserving the system of autocracy. But what happens when the target of the coup is not just the king, but the very principle of kingship? Across the continent, in the glittering heart of European culture, a storm was gathering that would not just depose a monarch, but would seek to decapitate monarchy itself. The Palace of Versailles in the late 18th century was a universe unto itself. It was a gilded fantasy of absolute power, a place of intricate etiquette, dazzling spectacle, and breathtaking expense. Here, King Louis XVI and his Queen, Marie Antoinette, presided over a court that seemed blissfully unaware of the world beyond the palace gates. But outside, France was a pressure cooker of discontent. Years of fiscal mismanagement, social inequality, and Enlightenment ideas were creating a volatile mixture. The French monarchy was not merely facing a political crisis, it was facing an existential threat. The French Revolution would become the greatest coup in history, a violent, chaotic overthrow that targeted not just a ruler, but an entire social and political order that had existed for 1,000 years. It began not with a conspiracy in the barracks, but with the rumblings of a hungry and angry populace. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was the first tremor of the earthquake to come. It was a symbolic act, the tearing down of a fortress of royal despotism. The revolution had found its voice, and it was the roar of the Parisian mob. In October of that same year, the revolution came to the gates of Versailles itself. Thousands of Parisian women, furious over the price of bread, marched the 12 miles to the palace. They were joined by revolutionaries and National Guardsmen. They swarmed the palace grounds, demanding bread and demanding to see the king. The royal family was trapped. After a tense standoff and a violent invasion of the palace, where the queen barely escaped with her life, the crowd forced the king and his family to relocate to Paris. They were escorted by the mob, their gilded carriage surrounded by people carrying the heads of their murdered bodyguards on pikes. The king was no longer the absolute monarch of Versailles. He was a prisoner in the Tuileries Palace in the heart of his rebellious capital. A king may forgive an insult, but a revolution never forgives a king. The final fatal break came in June of 1791. The royal family attempted to flee France in disguise, hoping to reach the border and rally support from foreign powers. It was a desperate gamble, the flight to Varennes. But they were recognized, stopped in the small town of Varennes, and ignominiously brought back to Paris. This failed escape destroyed what little trust remained between the king and his people. He was no longer seen as a misguided father of the nation, but as a traitor. The final act came on August 10, 1792. An armed mob, supported by revolutionary National Guardsmen, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king's last line of defense was his loyal Swiss Guard. They fought with desperate courage, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. They were slaughtered almost to a man, their red uniforms staining the palace floors and staircases. The king and his family, who had taken refuge with the Legislative Assembly, were arrested. The monarchy was officially abolished. The former king was now simply citizen Louis Capet. The revolution, like all seizures of power, needed to legitimize itself by eliminating the old ruler. A trial was held. Louis was charged with treason against the nation. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On January 21, 1793, he was taken to the Place de la Révolution and executed by the guillotine, the new, efficient engine of revolutionary justice. The execution of a king was a profound, world-shattering event. It was a ritual murder of the principle of monarchy itself. It declared that sovereignty resided not in a divinely appointed king, but in the people. The French Revolution had shown that a coup could be more than just a change of faces in the palace. It could be a complete upending of reality. The impersonal, mechanical slice of the guillotine was a world away from the intimate betrayals of the Byzantine court. But the old ways were not dead. As the 20th century dawned, the intimate, brutal, and bloody palace coup would make a shocking and gruesome return. The French Revolution aimed to remake society, but it led to a terrifying new form of state violence. So which was it at its core? A glorious dawn of freedom that finally broke the chains of tyranny and gave power to the people, or a bloody terror that unleashed chaos, murdered countless innocents, and ultimately devoured its own children? Tell us what you believe in the comments below. In the early hours of May 29, 1903, The city of Belgrade was quiet. But inside the royal palace, a gruesome drama was about to unfold that would shock the world with its medieval brutality. This was not a revolution of the masses like in France. This was a return to the most primal form of the palace coup, a conspiracy of military officers, a nighttime assault, and a savage assassination. The victims were King Alexander Obrenović of Serbia and his wife, Queen Draga. Their reign had been plagued by political instability. The king was seen as autocratic, and his marriage to Draga, a widow with a scandalous past who was 12 years his senior, had outraged much of the political and military establishment. A secret society of army officers, calling themselves the Black Hand, decided that the royal couple had to be eliminated for the good of the nation. The conspiracy was led by Captain Dragutin Dimitrievich, known as Apis, a man whose name would later become infamous for his role in sparking the First World War. For now, his target was his own king. The plan was a direct assault on the palace. In the dead of night, the conspirators, a group of about 28 officers, stormed the royal compound. They blew open the palace gates with dynamite, the explosion echoing through the sleeping city. A chaotic gun battle erupted in the darkness as the small number of loyal palace guards tried to fight back. The conspirators, fanning out through the palace, began a frantic, desperate search for the king and queen. They went from room to room, slashing tapestries, overturning furniture, their boots crunching on broken glass. For nearly 2 hours they could not find the royal couple. Some of the officers grew frustrated, believing the king and queen had escaped. Then, one of them noticed a secret door in the royal bedroom, concealed behind a wardrobe. They demanded it be opened. After a tense silence, the king's voice came from within, demanding to know who was there. He was promised his life if he surrendered. Trusting the word of his officers, King Alexander opened the heavy door. He and Queen Draga were revealed, standing in their nightclothes inside a small secret closet. What followed was not an arrest or a political execution. It was a frenzied massacre. The conspirators opened fire with their revolvers. The king and queen were riddled with bullets. Even after they had fallen, the officers, consumed by a kind of bloodlust, continued to attack the bodies with their swords and bayonets. The queen's body was savagely mutilated. It was a scene of almost unimaginable horror. But the conspirators' work was not done. They wanted to send a message to display their grim trophy to the world. They dragged the naked, mutilated corpses of the king and queen to a balcony and threw them into the palace garden below. Some doors of history are not opened with a key, but with dynamite and a bayonet. The May coup, as it came to be known, was a brutal success. The Obrenović dynasty was extinguished. The conspirators invited a rival dynasty, the Karađorđević, to take the throne. The killers, far from being punished, were hailed as national heroes. The Serbian coup of 1903 was a shocking throwback, a reminder that even in the modern age, the struggle for power could regress to the most primitive forms of violence. It was personal, intimate, and stomach-churningly brutal. But the 20th century would also see the perfection of a new kind of coup, one that replaced the frenzied butchery of Belgrade with the cold, quiet efficiency of a military operation. The dagger and the dynamite would be replaced by the radio broadcast and the ultimatum. To see this evolution, we must travel south to the ancient land of Egypt. In the years following the Second World War, the Kingdom of Egypt was a study in contrasts. It was a land of ancient wonders and modern nightclubs, of immense agricultural wealth and grinding poverty. Presiding over it all was King Farouk, a monarch known more for his extravagant lifestyle, his vast collections of everything from rare stamps to pornography, and his massive appetite than for his political acumen. His government was widely seen as corrupt and inept, and the army's humiliating defeat in the 1948 war against the newly created State of Israel had deeply shamed the officer corps. Dissatisfaction was simmering, particularly among a group of young nationalist military officers. They were not plotting a bloody assassination. They were planning something new, a clean, modern, almost bloodless coup d'etat. This clandestine group called itself the Free Officers. Their leader was a charismatic young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. They were not seeking to install a new king or enrich themselves. They were driven by a revolutionary ideology: to end the monarchy, expel the British military presence from the country, and restore Egyptian dignity. They planned their move with the precision of a military campaign because that is exactly what it was. In the 20th century, a throne could be toppled not by a dagger, but by a broadcast on the radio. The night of July 22, 1952, was the chosen moment. The operation began with textbook military efficiency. Small units of soldiers fanned out across Cairo, seizing key strategic points: the army headquarters, the telephone exchange, the radio station, the airport. The movements were so swift and quiet that most of the city's inhabitants slept through the dawn of a new era. King Farouk was at his summer palace in Alexandria. By the morning of July 23rd, the country was effectively under the control of the Free Officers, even if the king did not yet fully grasp it. At 7:30 in the morning, the second crucial phase of the coup began. The Egyptian people, tuning into their radios, did not hear the usual morning program. Instead, they heard a voice they did not recognize, the voice of Officer Anwar Sadat, reading a proclamation on behalf of the Free Officers. The statement announced that the army had seized control to purge the government of corruption and instability. It was a revolutionary moment, delivered not through the fury of a mob, but through the calm, disembodied voice of the airwaves. King Farouk, isolated in Alexandria, found his options rapidly disappearing. The army units in the north, which he had hoped would remain loyal, quickly joined the coup. The Free Officers sent the king an ultimatum: abdicate the throne in favor of his infant son and leave the country by 6 o'clock that evening. There was no room for negotiation. Farouk, facing the inevitable, agreed to the terms. That evening, on the Alexandria waterfront, a strange and melancholy ceremony took place. The deposed king, dressed in a white admiral's uniform, boarded the royal yacht Marusa to sail into exile. He was given a 21-gun salute, the formal honor due to a departing head of state. As the yacht pulled away from the shore, the man who had been the absolute ruler of Egypt just a day before stood on the deck, weeping. The 1952 Egyptian coup was a paradigm shift. It was swift, efficient, and virtually bloodless. It demonstrated a new model of power seizure for the post-colonial world, one based on military organization, control of communications, and psychological pressure. The monarchy was formally abolished the following year, and Egypt was declared a republic. The age of kings in the land of the pharaohs was over. This quiet, professional coup in Cairo stood in stark contrast to the bloody night in Belgrade. It was an internal affair, an army changing the destiny of its own nation. But as the 20th century wore on, the palace coup would become something else entirely, a proxy battleground for the clashing ideologies of a world divided, a stage where the internal politics of one nation became the flashpoint for a global Cold War. The final terrible act would play out in South America, the 11th of September. For most of the world, this date is synonymous with the year 2001. But for the people of Chile, it is forever linked to the year 1973. On that day, a palace coup of terrifying scale and consequence unfolded in the capital, Santiago. It was not a quiet military operation like in Egypt, nor was it a nocturnal assassination like in Serbia. It was a full-scale military assault with tanks in the streets and fighter jets in the sky, all aimed at one building, the presidential palace, La Moneda. This was the bloody climax of the Cold War in South America, a violent collision between a democratically elected socialist government and a right-wing military backed by the United States. At the center of the storm was President Salvador Allende, a Marxist doctor who had come to power through the ballot box. His program of nationalization and social reform had earned him the adoration of the poor and the bitter enmity of the wealthy elite, the business community, and the American government, which feared the spread of communism in its backyard. By 1973, Chile was a nation polarized and paralyzed. Political tensions were at a breaking point. The military, led by the newly appointed commander-in-chief, General Augusto Pinochet, a man Allende believed was loyal, was ready to strike. On the morning of September 11th, the Navy seized control of the port city of Valparaiso. Soon, tanks were rolling through the streets of Santiago, surrounding the presidential palace. General Pinochet and the other military leaders issued an ultimatum to President Allende: surrender, and he would be given safe passage out of the country. Allende, inside La Moneda with a small group of aides and bodyguards, refused. He was the constitutionally elected president, and he would not abdicate. He decided to make his last stand in the palace. He armed himself with an AK-47 assault rifle, a gift from Fidel Castro, and prepared to defend his democracy. In a series of radio broadcasts that morning, his voice crackling with defiance, he spoke to the Chilean people for the last time. He spoke of his loyalty to the people, denounced the treason of the armed forces, and in his final, haunting words, declared, "Long live Chile, long live the people, long live the workers. These are my last words, and I am certain that my sacrifice will not be in vain." Inside the palace, a desperate battle raged. Allende and his small band of loyalists fought back against the attacking soldiers, but the outcome was never in doubt. Just before noon, the final shocking phase of the assault began. British-made Hawker Hunter jets screamed over the skies of Santiago. They dived, firing rockets directly into the presidential palace. La Moneda, a symbol of Chilean democracy for over a century, erupted in flames and smoke. It was an image that would be broadcast around the world, a horrifying spectacle of a nation's military turning its most advanced weapons against its own seat of government. After the bombing, troops stormed the burning building. They fought their way through the shattered rooms. A little after 2 in the afternoon, they found President Allende. He was dead from gunshot wounds. The military junta would later claim he had committed suicide with the rifle Castro had given him, a narrative that remains disputed to this day. Whether he took his own life or was killed by the attacking soldiers, one thing was certain: the coup was complete. General Pinochet would go on to rule Chile for 17 years as a brutal dictator responsible for the torture and murder of thousands of his political opponents. The 11th of September of Santiago was the culmination of the long, bloody history of the palace coup. It showed how, in the modern age, the simple act of seizing power could escalate into a full-blown military operation, a civil war compressed into a single, tragic day. From the Praetorian's dagger in ancient Rome to the fighter jets over Santiago, the tools had changed, but the essence remained the same. It is the eternal, brutal story of the thirst for absolute power, the fragility of loyalty, and the terrible price of betrayal. The virus of the palace coup, born in the shadows of the throne, has proven to be ageless, adaptable, and eternally lethal. It is a reminder that the heart of power is not a gilded room, but a dark and bloody chamber where history is written by the victor, and the loser is silenced forever.